Chapter 15, Part 1, of A History of Greece, to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Sutton. A History of Greece, to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 15, Part 1. Chapter 15. The Syracusan Empire and the Struggle with Carthage. We have seen how the war in Greece, in its last stage, after the collapse of the Sicilian expedition, ceased to be a mere domestic struggle among Greek states and became a part of the greater struggle between Greek and barbarian. We have now to see how the strife of Greek and barbarian was renewed at the same moment in the West. It is indeed remarkable how these two episodes in the great conflict between Asia and Europe run parallel though separate courses in the 5th century. The victory of Himera, which beat back the Carthaginian invader from the shores of Sicily, was won in the same year which saw the repulsion of the Persian invader from the shores of Attica. After these triumphs of Hellas, both Persia and Carthage had long lain quiescent and left the Greek cities of east and west to live undisturbed, at war, or in peace among themselves. It was not till the mightiest city of eastern and the mightiest city of western Hellas came to blows and wore one another out in the conflict that the barbarian foes, discerning the propitious hour, once more made their voices heard in the Grecian world. Sicily, with an exhausted Syracuse, the Agean, with an exhausted Athens, invited Carthage and Persia alike to make an attempt to enlarge their borders at the expense of the Greek. Section 1. Carthaginian destruction of Selinus and Himera. After she had achieved the repulse and utter confusion of Athens, it might have seemed likely that Syracuse would succeed in founding a Sicilian empire. Her first task would be to reduce Catane and Naxos, and when this was done, the other cities, including luxurious Acragas, would hardly be able to resist. This prospect was disappointed by the intervention of a foreign enemy. But though the victory of Syracuse over Athens did not lead to a Syracusan empire, as the victory of Athens over Persia had led to an Athenian empire, it was followed, as in the case of Athens, by a further advance in the development of democracy. Had Hermocrates remained in Syracuse, in possession of his old influence, a change in this direction would hardly have come to pass. But he was appointed to command the auxiliary fleet, which Syracuse sent to Sparta's help in the Aegean, and when he had gone, the democratic mood of the citizens, excited by their recent efforts, vented itself in a decree pronouncing the deposition and banishment of Hermocrates. This was the work of his political opponent Diocles, who was thoroughgoing democrat. Diocles bore the same name as a far earlier lawgiver, belonging to the same class and age as Charondas and Zaleucus, who had drawn up the laws on which the Syracusan constitution rested. The accidental identity of name led in subsequent ages to a confusion, and we later find writers ascribing to the democratic reformer who rose into prominence now the legislation of his ancient namesake. In his popular innovations, Diocles borrowed ideas from the enemy, whom his country had just overthrown. The Athenian use of lot in the appointment of magistrates was adopted. Hitherto, the generals were also the presidents of the sovereign assembly, and had the unrestricted power of dismissing it at discretion. Diocles seems to have taken away this political function from the generals, and assigned the presidency of the assembly to the new magistrates, but with much smaller powers. The presidents, as we shall presently see, were able only to fine a speaker who was out of order. They could not silence him or break up the assembly. Such was the position of the greatest Sicilian city, a full-blown democracy, but without her chief citizen, to whom above all others she owed the deliverance from her danger. When the island was exposed for the second time to a Carthaginian invasion, the occasion of the war was the same which had brought about the Athenian invasion, the feud between Selinus and Segesta concerning some fields on their common frontier. In both cases, the dispute of these towns was a pretext, not the deeper cause. As Athens thought that the time had come for extending her commerce in the west, so Carthage deemed that the day had dawned for asserting anew her power in Sicily. And there were those who had not let fade the memory of the humiliation endured at Himera 70 years before, and longed to take a late revenge. Segesta, with no Athens to protect her now, ceded the disputed lands, but Selinus went on to exact further cessions, and the Elymian city appealed to Carthage. One of the two shafts, or judges in that republic, was Hannibal, the grandson of Hamilcar, who had been slain at Himera. The desire of vengeance, long deferred, dominated Hannibal, now almost an old man, and his influence persuaded the Senate to accept Segestes' offer to become a Carthaginian dependency in return for Carthaginian help. A grand expedition was fitted out, and Hannibal was named commander. 60 warships were got ready, 1,500 transports, 100,000 foot, 4,000 horse. The fleet was not intended to take part in the offensive warfare. It was stationed at Moetia to be a protection for the Phoenician Sicily, and a security in case of discomfiture. The army landed at Lilybaeum and marched straight to Selinus. The city had never been besieged before within the memory of its folk. Immunity had made it secure. The fortifications had been neglected. The Selinitines were engaged in building a temple of vast proportions to Apollo, or perhaps Olympian Zeus, when they were brought face to face with a sudden danger from Carthage. The house of the god was never completed. Of the pillars of the giants which were to support the massive roof, some stand in their places on the eastern hill. But the great drums and the capitals of others must be looked for some miles away in the quarries from which they were hewn, left there when the Carthaginian destroyer came. There was no time to repair adequately the walls of the Acropolis on the central hill. Hannibal surrounded it, and a breach was soon made. But the place was not in the foe's hands for 9 days, owing to the stubborn resistance which the inhabitants were able to offer in the narrow streets. The Siciliot sister cities were not prompt in aid. Syracuse promised to come to the rescue, and sent a force under Diocles, which arrived too late. Selinus was the first Siciliot city, which was stormed and sacked by the barbarian. She was not to be the last. The people were slaughtered without mercy. Only some women and children who took refuge in the temples were spared, not from any respect of the holy places, and carried into bondage. Those who escaped from the sack fled to Acragas. Thus Selinus fell, after a brief life of 2 centuries and a half. Hannibal had now done the work which Carthage had given him to do, but he had still to do the work which he had imposed upon himself. His real motive in undertaking the public duty of the Selinitine War was to carry out the private duty of ancestral vengeance. Against Selinus he had no personal grudge, and there he did not carry the work of destruction further than military considerations required. The buildings on the western hill, where he had pitched his camp, suffered much, but the injuries sustained by the temples on the Acropolis and on the eastern hill are due not to Hannibal's army, but to the earthquakes of later ages. It was to be a different case in the city which he now turned to attack. At Selinus, Hannibal was merely the general of Carthage. At Himera, he was the grandson of Hamilcar. Hannibal designed to capture Himera by his land force alone, and in this absence of a Carthaginian fleet, Hannibal's siege of Himera differs from Hamilcar's. The Greeks of Sicily were now bestirring themselves. The terrible fate of one of their chief cities had aroused them to a sense of their peril. The naval power which was supporting Sparta in the Aegean had been long ago recalled, and a force of 5,000, including 3,000 Syracusans under Diocles, came to the relief of Himera. This city had time to prepare for the danger, which she must have foreseen. But the besiegers, by means of mines, opened a breach in the wall, and although they were repelled and the defenders made a successful sally, the prospects of Himera looked black, when the fleet of 25 ships which had returned from the Aegean appeared in front of the city. Hannibal saved the situation by a stratagem. He spread abroad a report that he intended to march on Syracuse and to take it unprepared. Diocles, thoroughly deceived, decided to return home and carry off the citizens of Himera, leaving the empty town to its fate. He induced half the population to embark in the ships, which as soon as they had set the passengers in safety at Messana were to return for the rest. Diocles and his army departed in haste, not even waiting to ask Hannibal for the dead bodies of those who had fallen in the fight outside the walls, and for this neglect he was greatly blamed. When Hannibal saw that half his prey had escaped him, he pressed the siege more vehemently, determined to force an early entry before the ships returned. The fate of thousands, the vengeance of Hannibal, might turn on the event of a few minutes. On the 3rd day, the vessels of safety hove in sight of the straining eyes of the Himerans. It seemed that Hannibal was to be balked of his revenge, but the gods of Canaan prevailed in that hour of suspense. Before the ships of rescue could reach the harbor, the Spanish troops of Hannibal burst through the breach, and the town was in the hands of the Avenger. On the spot where Hamilcar, according to story, had offered up his life to the gods of his country, a solemn rite was held. 3,000 men who had survived the first indiscriminate slaughter were sacrificed with torture to appease his shade. Himera, the offending city, was swept utterly out of the world, and its place knew it no more. Having thus accomplished his duty to his country and his gods, Hannibal returned triumphant to Africa. The position which Carthage won in Sicily by this year's work, and her new policy of activity there, are reflected in the coinage of Segesta and Panormus. The transformation of Segesta into a Carthaginian dependency was displayed by the fact that she had ceased to coin her own money. But Carthage also showed that she intended to keep a firmer hand on her Phoenician dependencies. These cities had hitherto paid homage to Hellenic influences by adopting a coinage of Hellenic character. With Hellenic inscriptions, the coinage now comes to an end at Panormus, and is replaced by a coinage of Greek type indeed, but with a Phoenician legend. The word Ziz. The change seems to have been made just before the invasion, and it was significant of an anti-Greek movement. But the curious thing is that Himera, the city which was to be one of the first victims of the new policy, heralded in this numismatic reform, abandoned her old coinage with the cock, and struck a new coinage with a seahorse on the Punic model of Panormus. Are we to suppose that Himera, aware of the peril which menaced her, thought to avert it by a timely approach of friendship to her Phoenician neighbor, and that this coinage was part of a policy of Punicism intended to be only temporary? Syracuse, although she had sought to do something for Selinus, and had done something for Himera, felt no call to come forward as a champion against the new aggressive policy of Carthage. It was reserved for one of her citizens to attempt, on his private responsibility, the warfare which she declined to undertake against the Phoenician foe. The exile Hermocrates returned to Sicily, enriched by the gifts of the satrap Pharnabazus. His own city refused to withdraw the sentence of banishment, for a man of his views and abilities seemed dangerous to the democratic constitution. Hermocrates then resolved to earn his recall by performing conspicuous services to the Hellenic cause in Sicily, by winning back the Greek territory which the Phoenician had taken, by carrying Greek arms into Phoenician territory itself. He had built 5 triremes, he had hired 1,000 mercenaries, and he was joined by 1,000 Himeran fugitives. With these he marched to the spot where Selinus had once been, and made the place a center for a crusade against the Phoenician. He repaired the fortifications of the Acropolis on the central hill, and the remains of the well-built wall betray, by the capitals of columns used in the building, the circumstances of his erection. The adventure prospered. The band of Hermocrates soon increased to 6,000, and he was able to devastate the lands of Moetia and Panormus, and to drive back the forces which came out to meet him. In the same way he ravaged the territory of Solus, and the new Carthaginian Segesta. These successes of Hermocrates were of no greater significance than the actual injury dealt to the enemy. He had done what had not been done before, since the days of Dorius. He had broken into the precincts of Phoenician Sicily, and set an example to many subsequent leaders. Hermocrates was bent, above all things, on regaining his own country. Diocles and his political opponents were still powerful in the city, and able to hinder the revulsion of feeling which his successes caused from having any practical effect. Accordingly, he made another attempt to soften the hearts of his fellow citizens. It was a well-calculated move. He marched to the ruins of Himera, collected the unburied bones of the soldiers of Diocles, which Diocles had neglected, and sent them on wagons to Syracuse, himself remaining as an exile outside the Syracusan borders. He hoped to awaken the religious sentiment of the citizens in his own favor, and at the same time to turn it against his rival. The bones were received, and Diocles was banished, but Hermocrates was not recalled. Having failed to compass his restoration by persuasion, the exile resolved to compass it by force, and he was encouraged by his numerous partisans in Syracuse. He was admitted with a small band at the gate of Agrippina, and posted himself in the adjacent agora, awaiting for the rest of his forces to arrive. But they tarried too long. The people, learning that Hermocrates was in the city, rushed to the marketplace. The small band was soon overcome, and Hermocrates was slain. The Syracusans in these days were inspired with an instinctive rather than well-founded dread of tyranny, and this dread was stronger than admiration for Hermocrates. Their instinct was right. Tyranny was approaching, but he was not the man. They little guessed that their future master was an obscure follower of Hermocrates, who was wounded that day in the agora, and left for dead. End of Chapter 15, Part 1. Chapter 15, Part 2. Carthaginian Conquest of Acragas. The private warfare of Hermocrates in western Sicily had naturally provoked the wrath of the Carthaginians. Embassies passed between Carthage and Syracuse, Carthage regarding Syracuse as answerable for the acts of a Syracusan. But diplomacy was merely a matter of form. The African Republic has resolved to make all Greek Sicily subject to her sway. She made ready another great expedition, as great as if not greater than that which had been sent against Selinus, and at the same time she took the novel step of founding a colony on Sicilian soil. If Hermocrates had lived, Himera might have been partially restored like Selinus, But the destroyers of Himera now founded a city in the neighborhood which was to take Himera's place, on the hill above the hot baths of the nymphs, whereof Pindar sings. The Carthaginian colonists built their town, but it was not destined to retain its Phoenician character. The Greek strangers who were admitted to dwell in it transformed it before long into a Greek city. The Thermae of Himera preserved the memories of Himera, and the people were known as Thermites or Himerians indifferently. Acragas, the city which faces Carthage, was the first object of attack to the invaders, who now came to conquer and enslave all Greek Sicily. Since the days of Theron, Acragas had held aloof from all struggles in the island, and was now at the height of her prosperity. But she was enervated by peace and luxury, and when the day of trial came, she was found wanting. How far her citizens were prepared to endure the hardships of military life may be inferred from the law, passed with a view to the present peril, that none of the men in the watchtower should have more than a mattress, 2 pillows, and a quilt. Such were the austerities of the men of Acragas. But at least they paid homage to the different discipline of Sparta. They invited Dexippus, a Spartan, who was then at Gela, to undertake the conduct of the defense. A body of Campanian mercenaries was hired, and they could rely on the assistance of their old rivals the Syracusans, as well as of the other Greek cities, who were fully conscious that the peril of Acragas was their own, and Acragas herself behaved well. Notwithstanding her habits of ease, and her old practice of holding aloof, she refused the tempting offer of the invader that she should now purchase immunity by remaining neutral. She was true to her own race. She might remain indifferent when it was a struggle between Dorian and Ionian, but it was another case when the whole of Sicilian Hellas was threatened by the Phoenician. The army of Carthage was again under the command of Hannibal, who felt that he was too old for the work, and was assisted by his husband, Himilco. They pitched their main camp on the right bank of the river Hypsus, southwest of the city, and stationed some forces in another small camp on the eastern hill beyond the river Acragas, to act against Greek aids coming from the east. The point of attack was the part of the western wall close to the chief western gate, but the ground, though lower here, was still difficult for a besieger, and Hannibal determined to raise an immense causeway from which the wall could be more effectively attacked. The tombs of the neighboring necropolis supplied stones for the work, but as the tomb of Theron was being broken down, it was shaken by a thunderbolt, and the seers advised that it must be spared. Then a pestilence broke out in the Carthaginian camp, and carried off Hannibal himself. It seemed that the gods were wroth, and demanded a victim. Himilco lit the fires of Moloch, and sacrificed a boy. The causeway was then completed, but no further injury was done to the sepulchres. An army was already on its way to the relief of Acragas, 30,000 foot and 5,000 horse from Syracuse, Gela, and Camarina. When they approached the city, they were met by the forces which had been placed for this purpose on the eastern hill. A battle was fought, a victory gained, and the Greek army took possession of the lesser Carthaginian camp. Meanwhile, the routed barbarians fled for the refuge of the main camp, and their flight lay along the road beneath the southern wall of the city. There was a general cry to sally forth and cut them off, but the generals refused. The moment was lost, but presently the people, yielding to an impulse which the generals could not resist, went forth from the eastern gate to meet their victorious allies. A strange scene followed. The tumultuous assembly was held outside the walls. The Acragantine commanders were accused of failing in their duty, and when they essayed to defend themselves, the fury of the people burst out, and 4 generals were stoned to death. The direction of the defense seems now to have been shared by Dexippus within the city, and Daphnius, the commander of the Syracusan troops, without. Though the hostile camp was too strong to be attacked, the prospect looked favorable for Acragas. The Punic army, diminished though it had been by the plague, was sore bestead for lack of supplies, and it seemed certain that hunger and mutinous soldiers would soon force Himilco to raise the siege. But he learned that the provision ships were coming from Syracuse to Acragas. He sent in haste for the Carthaginian vessels at Panormus and Moetia, put out to sea with 40 triremes, and intercepted the supplies. This not only saved his league, but even reversed the situation. The besieged city now began to suffer from scarcity of food, and as soon as supplies began to run short, the weak point in the position of the Acragatines was displayed. They had found it needful to rely on mercenaries, and hirelings were not likely to serve long when rations ran short. The campaign was easily induced to transfer their service from Acragas to Carthage, but this was not all. It was commonly believed that Dexippus, like most Spartans abroad, incapable of resisting a bribe, received 15 talents from Himilco, and induced the Italia and Sicilia allies to desert Acragas as a sinking ship. But whatever the conduct of Dexippus may have been, the discredit of this desertion cannot rest entirely with him. The defense which had been maintained for 8 months with foreign aid was now left to the men of Acragas alone. They showed at once that they were shaped of different stuff from the men of Selinus. Overcome with despair, they resolved to save their lives, and abandon their city and their gods. Such a resolution, taken by the people of a great city, is unique in Greek history. It did not befit the men who had rejected the overtures of Hannibal, but it was what we might expect from the men who murdered their generals. They marched forth at night, men, women, and children, without lot or hindrance from the foe. They were compelled to leave, for the barbarians to pillage, those things which made their lives happy. The old and sick could not be sent out on the long journey to Gela, the place of refuge, and were left behind. Some too remained, who chose to perish at Acragas, rather than live in another place. The army of Hamilco entered the city in the morning and sacked it, slaying all whom they found, and despoiling and burning the temples. The great house of Olympian Zeus, the largest Greek temple in Europe, was still unfinished, and the sack of Hamilco decided it should never be completed. But Acragas was not to be destroyed. Like Selinus, it was intended to be a Carthaginian city in a Carthaginian Sicily. Hamilco made the place his winter quarters. Gela would be the next object of his attack when spring came round. End of Chapter 15, Part 2. Recording by Paul Sutton. Chapter 15, Part 3, of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Sutton. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 15, Part 3. For the catastrophe of Acragas, the chief blame was laid upon the Syracusan generals, who deserted her in the critical hour. The Acragantines were not slow to make them responsible for their own unheroic flight. At Syracuse itself, there was a feeling that these generals were hardly the men to meet the great jeopardy in which Sicily now stood, and there was one man who saw in the jeopardy the opportunity of his own ambition. It was Dionysius, a man of obscure birth, who had been a clerk in a public office. He had been a partisan of Hermocrates, by whose side he had stood in the last fatal fray, and had been wounded and left for dead. Recently he had marked himself out by his energy and bravery before the walls of Acragas. He saw the incompetence of the democratic government of his city. He saw that in the present peril it might be overthrown, and he determined to overthrow it. An assembly was held to consider the situation. Dionysius arose, and in a violent harangue accused the generals of treachery. His language was intended to stir up the hearers to fury. He called upon the people to rise up themselves and destroy the traitors without trial. His violence transgressed the constitutional rules of the assembly, but the presidents had no power to bridle him. They imposed a fine, the only resource they had, but a wealthy friend, Philistus the historian, came forward and paid the fine, bidding the speaker to go on, for as often as a fine was imposed, he would pay it. Dionysius carried his point. The generals were deposed, and a new board was appointed, of which Dionysius was one. This was only the first step on the road which was to lead to the Tyrannus. His next success was to procure the recall of the partisans of Hermocrates, who had been condemned to exile. These old comrades might be useful to him in his designs. At the same time, he sought to discredit his colleagues. He kept entirely apart from them, and spread reports that they were disloyal to Syracuse. Presently he openly accused them, and the people elected him sole general with the sovereign powers to meet the instant danger. This office, held before, as we have reason to think, by Gelon and Hero, did not set him above the laws, nor was the office illegal, though extraordinary. It may be compared to the Roman dictatorship, but it was the second step to the tyranny. The next step, as history taught him, the story of Pisistratus, for instance, was to procure a bodyguard. The assembly at Syracuse, which had perhaps begun to repent already of having placed so much power in the hands of one man, would certainly not have granted such an instrument of tyranny, but Dionysius was ingenious. He saw that the thing might be done elsewhere. He ordered the Syracusan army to march to Leontini, which it will be remembered was now a Syracusan dependency. He encamped near the town, and during the night a rumor was spread abroad that the general's life had been attempted, and he had been compelled to seek refuge in the Acropolis. An assembly was held next day, nominally an assembly of Syracusan citizens, which, when Dionysius laid bare the designs of his enemies, voted him a bodyguard of 600. This he soon increased to 1,000, and he had won over the mercenaries to his cause. These were the 3 steps in the despot's progress, which rendered Dionysius lord and master of Syracuse. His intrigues had won him first a generalship, then sole generalship with unlimited military powers, and finally a bodyguard. Syracuse, unwilling and embarrassed, submitted with evident chagrin, but was dominated by the double dread of the mercenaries and the Carthaginians. The democracy, of course, was not formally overthrown. Dionysius held no office that upset the constitution. Things went on, as at Athens, under Pisistratus. The assembly met and passed decrees and elected magistrates. The justification of the power of Dionysius lay in the need of an able champion to oppose Carthage, and his partisans represented him as a second Gellon. But though Dionysius was in later years to prove himself among the chief champions of Hellenic Sicily against the Punic powers, his conduct at this crisis did not fulfill the hopes of those who thought to compare him with the hero of Himera. The Carthaginians were already encamped at Gela. Their first act was to remove a colossal brazen statue of Apollo which stood, looking over the sea, on the hill to the west of the city. The Geloans defended their walls with courage and zeal, and when Dionysius arrived with an army of Italiots and Siciliots and a fleet of 50 ironclad ships to cooperate, it seemed as if Gela would escape the doom of Acragas. An excellent plan was arranged for a combined attack on the Carthaginian camp, which lay on the west side of the town. The plan failed, because the concert was not accurately carried out. The Siciliots, who were to assault the eastern side of the camp, arrived late on the spot, and found the enemy, who had already repelled the attack of the Italiots and the fleet on the southern and western sides, free to meet them in full force. This hitch in the execution of the plan was hardly a mere blunder. Dionysius with his mercenaries had undertaken to issue from the western gate of Gela and drive away the besiegers, while the rest of his army were attacking the camp. It seems, however, that Dionysius took no part in the fighting, and alleged that he was retarded by difficulties in crossing the town from the eastern to western gate. We shall probably do no injustice to Dionysius if we conclude that it was through this disposition that the Siciliots failed to act in concert with the Italiots. The action which he took after the defeat shows that he was half-hearted in the work. He decided, in a private council, as Diocles had decided at Himera, that the defense must be abandoned and the whole people of Gela removed. At the first watch of the night, he sent the multitude forth from the city, and followed himself at midnight, his way to Syracuse, led by Camarina. And here, too, Dionysius ruled that the whole people must forsake their home. The road to Syracuse was full of the crowds of helpless fugitives from the 2 cities. It was presently thought that these strange proceedings of Dionysius were carried out in collusion with the barbarians, that he had deliberately betrayed to them Gela, which might have been defended, Camarina, which had not yet been attacked. The Italiot allies showed, not their disgust only, but their apprehension, that the war was practically over, by marching immediately home. The horsemen of Syracuse seized the occasion for a desperate attempt to subvert the new tyrant. They rode rapidly to the city, plundered the house of Dionysius, and maltreated his wife, although she was the daughter of Hermocrates. When Dionysius heard the news, he hastened to Syracuse with a small force. He reached the gate of Acradina by night, and being refused admittance, burned it down with a fire of reeds, supplied by the neighboring marsh. In the marketplace he easily overmastered a handful of opponents. The remnant fled to Aetna, which now became, in a better cause, what Eleusis was to Athens after an overthrow of the 30. In what concerns the charge that the Syracusan tyrant had a secret understanding with Carthage, there is a strong case against him. The events are scarcely intelligible on any other view, but it was no more than a temporary disloyalty to the cause of Hellas and Europe, for which he was hereafter to do great feats. His first motive was the selfish motive of a tyrant. He wanted time to lay stable foundations for his still precarious power at Syracuse, and he judged that it would be a strong support to obtain a recognition of his power from the Carthaginian Republic. The Punicism of the Lord of Syracuse was not more unscrupulous than the Medism of the ephors of Sparta, to which it is the western parallel. The treaty, which was now agreed upon between Hamilco and Dionysius, was drawn up on the basis of uti possidetis. Each party retained what it actually held at the time. Syracuse acknowledged Carthage as a mistress of all Greek states on the northern and southern coasts, and also of the Secan communities. Acragas, what was left of Selinus, Gela, and Camarina, were all to be henceforward under Punic sway, and on the north coast Carthage had advanced her frontier to include the territory of Himera, in which she had planted her first colony. But all these cities were not to hold the same relation to their mistress. Acragas and Selinus, like Thermae, were subjects in the full sense of the word, but Gela and Camarina were to be only tributary and unwalled cities. The Elymian towns are not mentioned, but we have seen how Segesta became a subject of Carthage by her own act, and we can hardly doubt that Eryx was forced into the same condition. The terms of the treaty provided for the independence of the Sicel communities and the city of Messana, but it provided also for the independence of Leontini, and this was a point in which it departed from the basis ute Pisiditas, Leontini being a dependency of Syracuse. It was clearly a provision extorted from Dionysius, and intended by Himilco to be a source of embarrassment to Syracuse. On the other hand, as a counter-concession, nothing was said about the dependence of Naxos or Catane, so that Syracuse might have a free hand to deal with her old enemies without fear of violating the treaty. Such was the new arrangement of the map of Sicily at the end of the second Carthaginian invasion. An accidental consequence of that invasion had been to establish Dionysius as a tyrant of Syracuse. This consequence enabled Himilco to bring his work to a conclusion more easily and quickly than he had hoped. He could not foresee that the undoing of his work would be the ultimate result. The Carthaginians guaranteed to maintain the rule of Dionysius, who was soon to prove one of their most powerful foes. For Dionysius, this guarantee, the Syracusans shall be subject to Dionysius, was the most important clause in the treaty. Some suppose it was a secret clause. It was for the sake of this recognition and the implied promise of support that he stooped to betray Sicilian Hellas. We shall see how he redeemed this unscrupulous act of expediency by creating the most powerful Hellenic state in the Europe of his day. End of chapter 15, part 3. Recording by Paul Sutton. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Burry, Chapter 15, Part 4. First years of Dionysius. For half a century after the fall of Athens, it seemed likely that the destinies of Europe would be decided by a Greek city in the western Mediterranean. Under her new lord, Dionysius, Syracuse had become a great power, a greater power than any that had yet arisen in Europe. In strength and dominion, and influence and promise, she outstripped all the cities of the mother country, and in a general survey of the Mediterranean coast, she stands out clearly as the leading European power. The Greek states, to which the Persian king sent down his peace, were now flanked on either side by two great powers, and a political prophet might have been tempted to foretell that the communities of old Greece were doomed to perish between the monarchies of Susa and Syracuse, which threatened their freedom on the east and on the west. Those who were tempted to spy into the future might have conjectured that the ultimate conflict with Persia was reserved for a Sicilian conqueror, who should one day extend his dominion over eastern Greece and the Aegean, and as autocrat of Europe, oppose the autocrat of Asia. Though this war was not to be, though the expansion of Sicily was arrested, and the power which was to subdue Asia arose on the borders of old Greece, yet we shall see that in many ways the monarchy of Dionysius foreshadowed the monarchy of Philip and Alexander. It is in Sicily, not in old Greece, that we see the first signs of a new epoch, in which large states are to take the place of small, and monarchy is to supersede free institutions. The tyranny of Dionysius lasted for 38 years, till the end of his life. All that time it was maintained by force. All that time it was recognized as a violation of the Constitution and an outrage on the freedom of the people. The forms of the Constitution were still maintained. The folk still met and voted in the assembly, and Dionysius was either annually elected or permanently appointed general with absolute powers. But all this was pure form. His position was a fact, which had no constitutional name, and which made the Constitution of none effect. And it was by the compulsion, and not of their free will, that the mass of citizens continued to obey him. His bodyguard of foreign mercenaries was the support of his power. More than one attempt was made to throw off the yoke, but his craft and energy defeated the most determined efforts of his adversaries. Yet the unusual ability of Dionysius would not have availed more than the spearmen who were within call, to extend his unlawful reign to a length which a tyrant's reign seldom reached, if he had not discovered and laid to heart what may be called a secret of tyranny. While he did cruel and oppressive deeds for political purposes, he never committed outrages to gratify personal desires of his own. He scrupulously avoided all those acts of private insolence, which have brought the reigns of Greek tyrants into such ill repute. Many a despot had fallen, by the hand of fathers or lovers whom the dishonor of their nearest and dearest had spurred to the pursuit of vengeance at the risk of their own lives. Dionysius eschewed this mistake. His crimes and his enemies were political. When his son seduced a married woman, the discreet tyrant rebuked him. "It is well for you to chide me," said the young man, "but you had not a tyrant for your father. And if you go on doing this sort of thing," retorted Dionysius, "you will not have a tyrant for your son." This notable moderation of Dionysius in private life was perhaps the chief cause of the duration of his tyranny. Beyond the common motive of patriotism, men had no burning personal wrongs to spur them to encounter the danger of driving a dagger to the despot's heart. But besides this discretion, which made his government tolerable, his successes abroad counted for something, and it was more than once borne in Syracuse that his rule was necessary to protect her against her enemies. And we shall see that Dionysius was fully conscious that it conduced his own safety that there should be enemies against whom she needed a protector. The first concern of the new tyrant was to establish himself in a stronghold. As we have seen, the Acropolis of Syracuse was not, as in other cities, the hill, but the island, and it was the island which Dionysius made his fortress. He built a turreted wall on the north side of the isthmus, so as to bar the island off from the mainland, and he built two castles, one close to, if not on, the isthmus, the other at the southern point of the island. Whoever entered the island from Agrippina had to pass under 5 successive gates, and no one was allowed to dwell within the island fortress except those whom Dionysius regarded as his own friends and supporters. The scheme of fortifications took in the lesser harbor, which, with its new docks, became under Dionysius the chief arsenal of the Syracusan naval power. The mouth of this port was entirely closed by a mole, the galleys passing in and out through a gate which was only wide enough to allow one to pass at a time. Besides these defenses of stone, Dionysius strengthened his position by dealing rich rewards to confirm in their allegiance his friends and hirelings, and by forming a class of new citizens out of enfranchised slaves. The forfeited estates of his enemies supplied him with the means of carrying out both these acts of policy. It was not long before he had an unwelcome occasion of putting to the test both the walls of his fortress and the hearts of his followers. The most favorable opportunity for any attempt to overthrow the tyrant was when the Syracusan army was in the field. When the citizens had arms in their hands and were formed in military ranks, the word of a patriot could more easily kindle them to action than when they were engaged in their peaceable occupations at home. Dionysius led out the army against Herbessus, one of the cities of the Sicils. Mutinous talk passed from mouth to mouth, and the disaffected citizens slew one of the tyrant's officers, who rebuked them. Then the mutiny broke out loud and free. Dionysius hastened to Syracuse and shut himself up in his fastness. The revolted citizens followed and laid siege to their own city. They sent messages to Messana and Rhegium, asking these cities to help them to win back their freedom. And a succor of 80 triremes came in answer to their help. By sea and land they pressed Dionysius so hard in his island fortress that his case seemed desperate, and some of his mercenary troops went over to the enemy. Dionysius called a council of his most trusted friends. Some bade him flee on a swift horse. Others counseled him to stay till he was driven out. Halorus used a phrase which became famous: "Sovereign power is a fair winding sheet." Dionysius followed the counsel of these who bade him stay, but he resorted to a piece of craft which was more successful than he could have well hoped. He entered into negotiations with his besiegers and asked for permission to quit Syracuse with his own goods. They willingly agreed to the proposal and allowed him 5 triremes, and they were so convinced of his good faith that they dismissed a company of cavalry which had come to their aid from Aetna. But meanwhile Dionysius had sent a secret message to the Campanian mercenaries of Carthage, who had been left by Hamilco in some part of Sicily. 1,200 in number, they were permitted to come to the help of the tyrant, whose lordship had been recognized and guaranteed by Carthage in the recent treaty. The besiegers, thinking that the struggle was over, had half broken up their leaguer, and were in complete disorder. The Campanians occupied the hills of Apopoli without resistance. Dionysius sallied forth, and decisively, though without much shedding of blood, defeating the rebels in their neighborhood of the theater, a quarter of the city which we now find for the first time called Neapolis. Dionysius used his victory mildly. Many of the rebels fled to Aetna and refused to return to Syracuse, but those who returned were received kindly and not punished. As for the Campanians, to whom Dionysius owed his rescue, they did not return to the service of Carthage, but made a new home in the west of Sicily, in the Sycan town of Entella. They induced the inhabitants to admit them as new citizens, and one night they arose and slew all the men and married the women. Thus was formed the first Italian settlement on Sicilian soil. When the revolt broke out, we saw Dionysius aiming an attack at a Sicily city. The first step in the expansion of Syracusan power, which was the object of the tyrant's ambition, was the reduction of the Greek cities of the eastern coast and the neighboring Sicily towns. The Sicily towns were putting on more and more of a Hellenic character, and the reign of Dionysius marks a stage of progress in their Hellenization. We get a glimpse of political parties striving in Sicily, just as in Greek cities, and we find Himera ruled by a tyrant of Greek name. To attack the Sicilians was indeed a breach of the treaty with Carthage, but for the present Dionysius gained no success which obliged Carthage to intervene. He entered Himera indeed, but only to overthrow the local tyrant and leave the inhabitants to enjoy their freedom. He attacked Urbita, but his attack was fruitless. With the Greek cities which stood in his way, he was more successful. First of all, he captured Aetna, the refuge of Syracusan exiles and malcontents, and these dangerous enemies dispersed, we know not whither. Then he turned against the two Ionian cities, Catane and Naxos. In fear of such an attack, Catane had taken the precaution of allying herself with Syracuse's former vassal, Leontini. The sole record we have of this alliance is a beautiful little silver coin, with a laureled head of Apollo and the names of the two cities, one of an issue which was struck in the token of the treaty. But the support of Leontini did not avail. Both Catane and Naxos were won by gold, not by sword. Traitors opened the gates to the Dorian tyrant. In his treatment of these cities, Dionysius showed himself in his worst light. All the inhabitants of Naxos and Catane alike were sold as slaves in the Syracusan slave market. Catane was given over to Campanian mercenaries as a dwelling place, and thus became the second Italian town in Sicily. But the city of Naxos, the most ancient of all the Siciliot cities, was not even given to a stranger to dwell in. The walls and the houses were destroyed. The territory was bestowed upon the Sicilians, the descendants of the original possessors, and a small settlement near the old site barely maintained the memory of the name. Dionysius was one of the ablest champions of Greek Sicily against the Phoenician, yet here he appears in the character of a destroyer, dealing to Greek civilization blows such as we should expect only from the Phoenician foe. It is certain indeed that the severity of the doom which he meted out to these cities was meant to serve a purpose, for wanton severity was never practiced by Dionysius. We may suspect what that purpose was. The conquest of Naxos and Catane was of far less consequence to the lord of Syracuse than the recovery of Leontini. To win back this lost Syracusan possession was the first object of all in the eyes of a Syracusan ruler. Dionysius had already called upon the Leontines to surrender, but in vain, and perhaps he thought that the siege of the place would be long and tedious. When he pronounced the doom of Naxos and Catane, he was in truth besieging Leontini with his most effectual engines. And when he approached with his army, and summoned the Leontines to migrate to Syracuse and become his subjects under the name of Syracusan citizens, they did not hesitate to prefer that unwelcome change to the risk of faring still worse than the folks of Catane and Naxos. If we glance over Sicily at this moment, it comes upon us as a shock to discover that all of the cities of Greek Sicily which enjoyed sovereign powers at the time of the Athenian invasion, there remained now not a single independent community outside Syracuse herself, with the exception of Messana, who still kept watch upon her strait. The Carthaginians, and Dionysius between them, had swept all away. The recovery of the Leontine territory was a success which probably gratified the Syracusans as well as their master. It was indeed a direct defiance of Carthage, for the treaty had guaranteed the independence of Leontini. But Dionysius knew that a struggle with Carthage must come, and was not unwilling that it should come soon. He determined to equip Syracuse against all enemies who should come against her, and we next find him engaged in fortifying the city of an enormous scale. The fortification of the island had been intended mainly for his own safety against domestic enemies, but the works which he now undertook were for the city and not for the tyrant. The Athenian siege of Syracuse taught him lessons which he had taken to heart. It taught him that the commanding heights of Epipolae must not be left for an enemy to seize, and therefore that it must become part of the Syracusan city, enclosed within the circuit of the Syracusan walls. It taught, too, the decisive importance of the western corner of Euryalus, and the necessity of constructing a strong fortress at that point, which has been called the key of Epipolae and of all Syracuse. These walls were built in an incredibly short space of time by 60,000 freemen, under the supervision of Dionysius himself. He seems to have inspired the citizens with the ambition of making their city the most strongly fortified place in the whole Greek world. The northern wall from Tycha to Euryalus, a distance more than 3 miles, was completed in 20 days. The striking ruins of the massive castle of Euryalus, with its curious underground chambers, are a memorial indeed of a tyrant's rule. But they are more than that. They are a monument of Greek Syracuse at the period of her greatest might, when she became for a moment the greatest power in Europe. It was no small thing to have carried out this enormous system of fortifications, which made Syracuse the vastest of all Greek cities. But Dionysius showed his surpassing energy and resource in preparing for an offensive as well as for defensive warfare. In military innovations, he is the forerunner of the great Macedonians, and the originator of the methods which they employed. He first thought out and taught how the heterogeneous parts of a military armament, the army and the navy, the cavalry and the infantry, the heavy and the light troops, might be closely and systematically coordinated so as to act as if they were a single organic body. He first introduced, his engineers first invented, the catapult, which, if it did not revolutionize warfare in general, like the discovery of gunpowder, certainly revolutionized siege warfare, and introduced a new element into military operations. An engine which hurled a stone of 200 or 300 weight for a distance of 200 or 300 yards was extremely formidable in close quarters. In naval warfare, he was also an innovator. He constructed ships of huger size than had ever been built before, with 5 banks of oars. He largely increased the fleet, which, counting vessels of both the larger and the smaller kind, seems to have numbered about 300 galleys. End of chapter 15, part 4. Recording by Paul Sutton. Chapter 15, Part 5, of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Sutton. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 15, Part 5. First Punic War of Dionysius. When his preparations were complete, Dionysius went forth to do what no Greek leader in Sicily had ever done before. He went forth, not merely to deliver Greek cities from Phoenician rule, but to conquer Phoenician Sicily itself. Marching along the south coast, he was hailed as a deliverer by the Greek dependencies of Carthage, both by the tributary towns Gela and Camarina, and the subject town of Acragas. Thermae on the northern coast likewise joined him, and of the 2 Elemian towns, Eryx received his overtures, while Segesta remained faithful to her Punic mistress. At the head of a host, which for a Greek army seems immense, 80,000 foot, it is said, and more than 3,000 horse, Dionysius advanced to test his new siege engines on the walls of Moesia. This city, which now for the first and for the last time becomes the center of a memorable episode in history, was like the original Syracuse, an island town. But though it was joined to the mainland by a causeway, the town did not, like Syracuse, spread to the mainland. It was surrounded entirely by a wall, of which traces still remain, and the bay in which it lay was protected on the seaside by a long spit of land. The men of Moesia were determined to withstand the invader to the uttermost, and the first measure they took was to insulate themselves completely by breaking down the causeway which bound them to the mainland. Thus they hoped that Dionysius would have to trust entirely to his ships to conduct the siege, and that he would be unable to make use of his artillery. But they knew not the enterprise of Dionysius, nor the excellence of his engineer department. The tyrant was determined to assault the city from solid ground, and to bring his terrible engines close to the walls. He set the crews of his ships to the work of building a mole far greater than the causeway which the Moetians had destroyed. The ships themselves, which he did not destine to play any part in the business of the siege, he drew up on the northern coast of the bay. The mole of Dionysius at Moesia forestalls a more famous mole, which we shall hereafter see erected by a greater than Dionysius at another Phoenician island town, older and more illustrious than Moesia. While the mole was being built, Dionysius made expeditions in the neighborhood. He won over the Sicans from their Carthaginian allegiance, and he laid siege to Aleman, Segesta, and Campanian, and Tella. Both these cities repelled his attacks, and leaving them under blockade, he returned to Moesia when the solid bridge was completed. In the meantime, Carthage was preparing an effort to rescue the menaced city. She tried to cause a diversion by sending a few galleys to Syracuse, and some damage was caused to ships that were lying in the great harbor. But Dionysius was not to be diverted from his enterprise. He had doubtless foreseen such an attempt to lure him away, and knew that there was no real danger. Hamilco, the Carthaginian general, seeing that Dionysius was immovable, sailed with a large force to Moesia, and entered the bay, with the purpose of destroying the Syracusan fleet, which was drawn up on the shore. Dionysius seems to have been taken by surprise. For whatever reason, he made no attempt to launch his galleys. He merely placed archers and slingers on those ships which would be first attacked. But he brought his army round to the peninsula which forms the western side of the bay, and on the shores of this strip of land he placed his new engines. The catapults hurled deadly volleys of stones upon Hamilco's ships, and the novelty of these crushing missiles, which they were quite unprepared to meet, utterly disconcerted the Punic sailors, and the Carthaginians retreated. Then Dionysius, who was no less ready to treat earth as water than to turn sea into land, laid wooden rollers across the neck of land which formed the northern side of the bay, and hauled his whole fleet into the open sea. But Hamilco did not tarry to give him battle there. He went back to Carthage, and the men of Moesia were left unaided to abide their fate. As the site of the island city required a special road of approach, so its architecture demanded a special device of assault. Since the space in the city was limited, its wealthy inhabitants had to seek dwelling room by raising high towers into the air, and to attack these towers, Dionysius constructed siege towers of corresponding heights, with 6 stories, which he moved up to near the walls on wheels. These wooden belfries, as they were called in the Middle Ages, were not a new invention, but they had never perhaps been built to such a height before. And it is not till the Macedonian age, which Dionysius in so many ways foreshadows, that they came into common use. It was a strange sight to see the battle waged in midair. The defenders of the stone towers had one advantage. They were able to damage some of the wooden towers of the enemy by lighted brands and pitch. But the arrangements of Dionysius were so well ordered that this device wrought little effect, and the Phoenicians could not stand on the wall which was swept by his catapults while the rams battered it below. Presently a breach was made, and the struggle began in earnest. The Moetians had no thought of surrender. Dauntless to the end, they defended their streets and houses inch by inch. Missiles rained on the heads of the Greeks, who thronged through, and each of the lofty houses had to be besieged like a miniature town. The wooden towers were wheeled within the walls. From their topmost stories, bridges were flung across to the upper stories of the houses, and in the face of the desperate inhabitants, the Greek soldiers rushed across these dizzy ways, often to be flung down into the street below. At night the combat ceased. Both besiegers and besieged rested. The issue was indeed certain, for however bravely the Moetians might fight, they were far outnumbered. But day after day the fighting went on in the same way, and Moesia was not taken. The losses on the Greek side were great, and Dionysius became impatient. Accordingly he planned a night assault, which the Moetians did not look for, and this was successful. By means of ladders, a small band entered the part of the town which was still defended, and then admitted the rest of the army through a gate. There was a short and sharp struggle, which soon became a massacre. The Greeks had no thought of plunder, they thought only of vengeance. Now for the first time a Phoenician town had fallen into their hands, and they resolved to do it as the Phoenicians had done to Greek cities. They remembered how Hannibal had dealt with Himera. At length Dionysius stayed the slaughter, which was not to his mind, since every corpse was a captive lest to be sold. Then the victors turned to spoil the city, and its wealth was abandoned to them, without any reserve. All the prisoners were sold into slavery, except some Greek mercenaries, whose treachery to the Hellenic cause was expiated by the death of crucifixion. A Sicilian garrison was left in the captured city. After this achievement, the like of which had not been wrought before in Sicilian history, Dionysius retired for the winter to Syracuse. Next spring he marched forth again to press the siege of Segesta, which was still under blockade. In the meantime the fall of Moesia had awakened Carthage into action. She saw that she must bestir herself if she was not to let her whole Sicilian dominion slip out of her hands. Hamilco was appointed Shafet, and entrusted with the work of saving Punic Sicily. He collected a force, which seems to have been at least as large as that which Dionysius had brought into the field, and set sail with sealed orders for Panormus. A small portion of the armament was sunk by Leptines, brother of Dionysius, who was in command of the Syracusan fleet, but the main part disembarked in safety. And then events happened in rapid succession, which are hard to explain. Hamilco first gains possession of Eryx by treason. Then he marches to Moesia and captures it, and then Moesia is lost. Dionysius raises the siege of Segesta and returns to Syracuse. The loss of Eryx could not be provided against. But it is hard to discern why Dionysius should have made no attempt to relieve Moesia, whose capture had cost him so much the year before, or why he should have allowed the Carthaginian army to march from Panormus to Eryx and Moesia without attempting to intercept it. He could not have more effectually pressed the siege of Segesta than by dealing a decided check to Hamilco. Not knowing the exact circumstances, not knowing even the number of the two armies, we can hardly judge his action. but it may be suspected that Dionysius was by nature a man who did not care to risk a pitched battle unless the advantage were distinctly on his own side. It is to be remembered that he won nearly all his successes by sieges and surprises, by diplomacy and craft, and that the names of his great military innovator is not associated with a single famous battle in the open field. When he had once allowed Moesia to be taken, his retreat is not surprising, for he had no base in the western part of the island, and we are told that his supplies were failing. He had now lost all that he had won in his first campaign. Moesia, however, was wiped out as a Phoenician city, though it was not to be a Greek or Sicil stronghold. Himilco, instead of restoring the old colony, founded a new city hard by to take its place. On the promontory of the island, which forms the south side of the Moeotian Bay, arose the city of Lilybaeum, which was henceforth to be the great stronghold of Carthaginian power in the west of the island. The sea washed two sides of the town, and the walls of the other two sides were protected by enormous ditches cut in the rock. The history of Lilybaeum is the continuation of the history of Moesia, but it was not destined to be taken either by a Greek or a Roman besieger. Having driven the invader from Phoenician Sicily, and having laid the foundation of a new city, Himilco resolved to carry his arms into the lands of the enemy, and to attack Syracuse itself. But he did not go directly against Syracuse. Before he attempted that mighty fortress, he would try the easier task of capturing Messana. The fall of this city would be a grievous blow to Hellas, and it would be no mean vengeance for the fall of Moesia. The walls of Messana had been allowed to fall into decay, and the place was an easy prey for the Carthaginians, but the greater part of the inhabitants escaped into fortresses in the neighboring hills. The Carthaginian general had to wreak his vengeance on the stones. He raised the walls and the edifices, and the work was done so well that no man, we are told, would have recognized the site. If the triumphant demolition of the Sicilian city, which watched the strait, was a sore blow to the Hellenic cause, Himilco sought at the same moment to deal another blow to that cause by the foundation of a new Sicilian city in another place. It was his policy to cultivate the friendship of the Sicils, and to foment the dislike which they felt towards the lord of Syracuse. Dionysius, too, had sought to win influence over the native race, and we saw how he gave them the territory of Naxos. The Carthaginian general grasped at that idea of erecting a new town for these very Sicils of Naxos, on the heights of the Taurus, which rise above the old site. Such was the strange origin of the strong city of Tauromenion, with its two rock citadels, one of the fairest sites in Sicily. It was the second foundation of Himilco in the same year, and both his foundations were destined signally to prosper. Lilybaeum became more famous than Moesia, and Tauromenion has had a greater place in history than Naxos. As a founder of cities, Himilco was a high title to fame. He was, like Dionysius, a creator as well as a destroyer. The creation of new cities and the destruction of old, by Greeks and Phoenicians alike, was a characteristic feature of this epoch. Dionysius was preparing in the meantime to protect Syracuse. He committed the command of the fleet, which appears to have been now about 200 strong, to his brother Leptines, and fleet and army together moved northward to Catane. In the waters near the shore of Catane, a naval battle was fought, and the Greek armament was defeated with great loss. It was indeed far outnumbered by the fleet of the Phoenicians, who also used their transport vessels as warships. But the cause of the disaster was the bad generalship of Leptines, who did not keep his ships together. The rout was witnessed by Dionysius from the shore, and it might have been retrieved by a victory on the land. Himilco and his army had not yet arrived on the scene, for an eruption of Etna had made the direct road impassable and forced them to make a long detour. Dionysius again shrank from risking a battle, though the men of Sicily were eager to fight. He retreated to the walls of Syracuse. This city was the last bulwark of Greek Sicily, and with it the cause of Greek civilization was in jeopardy. It was a moment at which the Siciliots might well sue for help from their fellow Greeks beyond the sea. Dionysius dispatched messages to Italy, to Corinth, and to Sparta, imploring urgently for succor. It was not long before the victorious Carthaginian fleet sailed into the great harbor, and the Carthaginian army encamped hard by, along the banks of the Anapus. The mass of the host encamped as well as it could in the swamp, but the general pitched his tent on the high ground of Palicna, within the precinct of the Olympian Zeus. This insult to the religion of Hellas was followed up by a more awful sacrilege when Himilco pillaged the temple of Demeter and Kore on the southern slope of Epipoli. When the barbarians began to perish in the plague-stricken marsh, the pestilence was imputed to the divine vengeance for these acts of outrage. The besiegers must have sat for no brief space before the walls of Syracuse. The messengers of Dionysius had time to reach the Peloponnesus and return with succor, 30 ships under a Lacedaemonian admiral. Hamilco had time to build 3 forts to protect his army and his fleet, one near his own quarters at Palicna, one at Descan on the western shore of the harbor, and one at Plemmyrion. After the arrival of the auxiliaries, the capture of a Punic corn ship was the occasion of a small naval combat in the harbor. Only a few of the Carthaginian ships were engaged, and the Syracusans were victorious. Within the town there was deep dissatisfaction with Dionysius and his conduct of the war, and the citizens thought that they might reckon on the sympathy of their Peloponnesian allies with an attempt to cast off the tyrant's yoke. At an assembly which the tyrant convened, the feeling of dissatisfaction broke openly forth, and the Lord of Syracuse could not only read in the faces, but hear in the words of the citizens, the depth of their hatred. But the movement of the revolution was checked by the Peloponnesians, who said that their business was to help Dionysius against the Carthaginians, not to help the Syracusans against Dionysius. So the danger passed over. But the tyrant had a warning, and he put on winning manners and accorded popularity. The deadly airs of the swamp in the burning heat of summer were doing their work. The army of Hamilco was ravaged by pestilence. Soon the soldiers fell so fast that they could not be buried. The hour had now come for the men of the city to complete the destruction which their friends had begun. It was just such a case as called forth the energy and craft of the ruler of Syracuse, and showed him at his best. He devised his attack with great skill. 80 galleys under Leptines and the Spartan captain were to attack the Carthaginian fleet, which was anchored off the shore of Descan. He himself led the land forces, marching by a roundabout road on a moonless night, and suddenly appeared at dawn on the west side of the Punic camp. He ordered his horsemen and 1,000 mercenaries to attack the camp here, but the horsemen had secret commands to abandon the hired soldiers once they were in the thick of the fight, and ride rapidly round to the east of the camp, where the true attack was to be made. The attack on the west was only a feint, to distract the attention of the enemy from the other side, and for this purpose Dionysius sacrificed the lives of the hirelings, whom he did not trust. The real attack on the east was made on the forts of Descan and Palicna. Descan was assailed by the horsemen along with a special force of triremes, which had been sent across the bay. Dionysius himself went round to lead the attack on Palicna. The plan was carried out with perfect success. The 1,000 hirelings were cut to pieces, the forts were captured, and the victory on the land was crowned by the destruction of the Carthaginian fleet. The Syracusan galleys bore down upon the enemy, before they had time fully to man their vessels, much less to row well out to sea, and the beaks of the triremes crashed into the defenseless timber. There was slaughter but hardly a fight, and then the land troops, fresh from their victory, rushed down to the beach and set fire to the transports and all vessels which had not left the shore. A wild scene followed. The high wind propagated the flames, and the cables were burnt asunder, and the bay of Descan was filled with drifting fireships, while amid the waters despairing swimmers were making for the shore. Fate had indeed delivered the barbarians into the hands of the Greeks, and the Greeks were determined to wreak their vengeance to the uttermost, and extirpate the destroyers of Messana. Dionysius had approved himself the successor of Gelon. The double victory of Descan was worthy to be set beside the victory of Himera, but Dionysius was not capable of absolute sincerity in the part he played as the champion of Hellas. He could not act to the end as a Syracusan patriot with singleness of heart. This was the fatality of his position as a tyrant. Conscious that his autocracy rested on unstable foundations, he fought against Carthage, but it was always with the resolve that the power of the Carthaginians should not be annihilated in Sicily. The Punic peril was a security for his tyranny, by making him necessary to Syracuse. The Syracusans must look to him as their protector against the ever-present barbarian foe. This was another secret of tyranny discovered by Dionysius. The Punic subtlety of Hamilco, enlightened by passages in the tyrant's past career, formed no doubt a shrewd idea of this side of his policy. The Carthaginian saw that his hope of safety lay in bargaining with Dionysius. Secret messages passed, and Dionysius agreed to allow Hamilco, along with all those who were Carthaginian citizens, to sail away at night. In payment for this collusion, he received 300 talents. Dionysius recalled his reluctant army from their assault on the camp, and left it in pieces for 3 days. On the 4th night, Hamilco set sail with 40 triremes, leaving his allies and his mercenaries to their fate. It was an act of desertion which was likely to repel mercenary soldiers from the Carthaginian service in the future, and this was doubtless foreseen by the crafty tyrant. But the squadron of fugitive triremes did not escape untouched. The noise of their oars as they sailed out of the harbor was detected by the Corinthian allies, and they gave the alarm to Dionysius. But Dionysius was purposely slow in his preparations to pursue, and the impatient Corinthians sailed out without his orders and sank some of the hindmost of the Punic vessels. Having connived at the escape of Himilco, the tyrant was energetic in dealing with the remnant of Himilco's host. The Sicil allies had escaped to their own homes, and only the mercenaries were left. These were slain or made slaves, with the exception of a band of strong and valiant Iberians, who were taken into the service of the tyrant. Thus ended the first struggle of Dionysius with Carthage, and it ended in a complete triumph for the Greek cause. The dominion of the African city was now circumscribed within its old western corner, and the greater part of the rest of Sicily was subject, directly or indirectly, to the rule of the Lord of Syracuse. Both from Greek and from barbarian Sicily, a famous city had been blotted out. But Moeotia had been revived in Lilybaeum, and Messana was soon to rise again upon her ruins. End of Chapter 15, Part 5. Recording by Paul Sutton. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 15, Part 6. Second Punic War and Sicil conquest of Dionysius. The equivocal policy of Dionysius in his hostilities to Carthage was manifested clearly enough in the course which he pursued after his great victory. It was the most favorable moment that had yet come in the struggle of centuries, for driving the barbarians out and making Sicily a Greek island from the eastern to the western shore. Carthage could not readily gather together such another armament as that which had been destroyed. No patriot leader who was devoted to the Greek cause, heart and soul, with singleness of aim, would have failed to follow up the great success by an invasion of western Sicily. But the preservation of his own precarious despotism was the guiding principle of Dionysius, and he saw in the barbarian corner of the island a palladium of his power. The next Punic War broke out 5 years later, and part of the meantime had been occupied by Dionysius in extending his power over the Sicils. He annexed to his dominion Morgantina, Cephalodion, and Henna itself. He made treaties with the tyrants of Agean and Centaripa, and with other places. But among all the Sicil towns, that which it was most important for him to win was the new foundation of the Carthaginian on the heights of Taurus. He laid siege to Tauromenium in the depth of winter. Operations of war in the winter season are one of the features of the reign of Dionysius, which separate it from the habits of older Greece and link it to the age of the Macedonian monarchy. The tyrant himself led his men on a wild and moonless night up the steep ascent to the town. One of the citadels was taken, and the assailants entered the place. But the Syracusan band was outnumbered and surrounded. 600 were killed, and the rest were driven down the cliffs. Of these, Dionysius was one. He reached the bottom, barely alive, after the precipitous descent. In the course of the extension of his power, on the northern coast, Dionysius had advanced to the limits of the Phoenician corner, and had won possession, through domestic treachery, of Solus, the most easterly of the 3 Phoenician cities. Of the circumstances we know nothing, but the conquest would seem to have been rather a piece of luck than part of any deliberate plan of aggression on the part of the Greek tyrant. No treaty appears to have been concluded between Carthage and Syracuse after the defeat of Himilco, so that the capture of Solus was not a violation of the peace, but only an occasion for the reawakening of hostilities, which had been permitted to sleep by tacit consent. At all events, it must have had something to do with the renewal of the war, a renewal for which our records assign no causes. At the opening of the Second War, we find a Carthaginian general commanding the Phoenician forces of the island, but without any troops, so far as we know, from Africa. The general was Mago, who in the previous war had been commander of the fleet. His army was doubtless considerably inferior to the forces which Dionysius could muster. Certain it is that on this occasion Dionysius did not hesitate to give him battle, and did not fail to defeat him. Carthage saw that she must make a more vigorous effort, and she gave Mago a large army, 80,000 men, it is said, to retrieve his ill success. To meet the invader, Dionysius entered into a close league with the strongest Sicil power in the land, his fellow tyrant, Agirus of Agean. This is a special feature of the Second Punic War. The cause of Europe is upheld by a federation of the 2 European powers of the island, Sicil and Greek. The Carthaginian army advanced into Sicil territory, seeking to win the Sicil towns, but Agirus and his men waged a most effectual manner of warfare, cutting off all the foraging parties of the enemy, and thus starving them by degrees. This they were able to do from their knowledge of their native hills, but it seems that the Syracusans were dissatisfied with this slow method, which was thoroughly to the taste of Dionysius. What happened is not clear, but we learn that the Syracusans marched away from the camp, and that Dionysius replaced them by arming the slaves. Then the Greeks and the Sicils must have won some unrecorded success, or the Carthaginian host must have been already terribly deplenished. Then the Greeks and the Sicils must have won some unrecorded success, or the Carthaginian host must have been already terribly deplenished by the want of the food. For we next find Mago suing for peace. This peace, although it is said to have been based on the treaty which Dionysius had made 12 years before, was in truth altogether different, for the parts of the two powers were reversed. All the Greek communities of Sicily were now placed under the direct or indirect power of Syracuse. The Carthaginian power was confined to the western corner. Nothing is said of Solus. It must have been now handed over to Carthage, if Mago had not already recovered it by arms. But the most striking provision of the treaty is that which placed the Sicils under the rule of Dionysius. Nothing is said of Agirium, and we are almost driven to wonder whether there was here any treachery to Agirus, of whom we hear nothing further. But there was a special clause touching Tauromenium, and acting on this clause, Dionysius immediately took possession of the town, expelled the Sicils, and established the fortress of those mercenary settlements which were characteristic of his age. Such was the end of 2 Punic Wars, which were in truth rather but a single war broken by an interval of quiescence. End of chapter 15, part 6. Recording by Paul Sutton.